Avoidance will pull away after moments of vulnerability, especially a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant that leans heavily dismissive. You had an intimate evening together. You had a deep conversation. Or maybe you had a vacation, a holiday together where things got really close and it felt wonderful. And suddenly, right after, they're pulling away. They're getting cold. They're getting distant. They're not communicating much. They're being less affectionate. And it usually immediately follows after emotional closeness was building, after there was vulnerability. Maybe you did have a deep emotional conversation. That gives them a lot of anxiety because emotional closeness feels extremely unsafe to this person. So instinctively, they seek to create emotional distance to feel safe again, to regulate themselves again. This all stems back to this person's childhood. They were on the receiving end of consistent childhood emotional neglect. Their emotional needs were not met at all. Often growing up in seemingly stable households, not always, but where they weren't given that unconditional love. You don't talk about feelings. And when they expressed their own emotions, they would have it rejected and dismissed. The mentality of children are meant to be seen, not heard. So they learned that their feelings were not safe to express. Their feelings weren't welcome. And they weren't given that nurturing. And they personalized that, growing up to feel defective and unlovable. So because of that wound, it's a wound of shame, they put up these barriers, these walls around their heart, a castle wall. And they keep their partner on the other side of that wall because their deep fear is if I lower my walls and I really let my partner in, my partner is going to figure out that I'm defective. My partner is going to figure out that I'm not lovable. They're going to reject me. I will get abandoned if I get too vulnerable. So emotional closeness feels unsafe because they actually directly associate emotional closeness with rejection and abandonment. So emotional distance is where they feel safe because they can't get exposed for being unlovable if they have distance between themselves and their partner. It's all fear-based, anxiety-based, insecurity-based. It's not actually based in reality, but fear is one of the most powerful human emotions, and it's also one of the most irrational. And avoidants are people that operate with a strong sense of fear. And that fear largely gets triggered by things like emotional intimacy and closeness. They often prefer to keep relationships surface level conversations, not letting things go too deep. And when you try to steer it in a deep direction, they'll often try to steer it away, or they'll just shut down and get cold, or just redirect the conversation altogether. They prefer superficial, surface level relationships because that way there's not too much closeness. They get to keep the distance. They get to control the distance. They get to feel like they're safe because they're not getting too vulnerable. There's not too much emotions. It's surface level validation. Now, deep down, they do long for that connection and that intimacy. So they'll seek out a partner that represents all the things that they want. But when they get that partner, the one that's emotionally available to them, it triggers their fears and they instinctively push this person away, eventually ending the relationship because their anxieties get too high. Now, they do find it easier to commit to a partner that is emotionally unavailable. And typically, their longer relationships will be with unavailable partners, such as other avoidants or narcissists. That's because the unavailable partner also has their walls up. So the avoidant has an excuse to keep their walls up. They don't have to get vulnerable with this person. It is a superficial relationship. It feels safe. But ultimately, that relationship is unfulfilling to them because deep down, they do want love, they do want connection, they do want intimacy. So eventually, they leave that superficial relationship with the unavailable partner to seek out something more meaningful. But then when they find it, it triggers them and they push that person away. And this cycle can continue over and over again until the avoidant actually gets to a place where they're willing to self-reflect and work on themselves and learn to become emotionally available and heal those attachment wounds. So, if you had a wonderful time with your avoidant partner or your avoidant ex, and then suddenly the next day or shortly thereafter, they're pushing you away or even abruptly ending the relationship and discarding you, it's because things got too close. It's because it got too real. It's because they got too vulnerable, and that gave them anxiety. And when they get anxiety, Their instinct is to protect themselves, which is to push their partner away, avoid dealing with any of their insecurities, avoid accountability, just avoid, because that's what they learned to do. They were never shown how to process this stuff or deal with it, so they learned to not deal with it, to avoid it. It doesn't mean that you weren't good enough. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. If you showed up and it was a healthy, seemingly loving relationship and they pushed you away, well, it's because their fears were triggered by the closeness. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It actually means you did everything right.